Good morning, good afternoon, and good day to you all, and welcome to the detailed plot summary of truly one of the best books ever written, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. A story about the complexities of science and the duality of human nature. In a nutshell, Dr. Jekyll is a kind, well-respected and intelligent scientist who meddles with the darker side of science as he wants to bring out his second nature. It is a tale of mystery, death and detective work, as encapsulated by one of the best lines in English literature. If he be Mr Hyde, I shall be Mr Seek. Oh, Stevenson is such a witty man. That's the best joke in the whole book, guys, so look forward to that. So without further ado, we will explore this story chapter by chapter. Chapter 1. Story of the Door. Who knew doors could be so exciting? Buckle up, guys. So basically, there's this lawyer, Gabriel Utterson. Yes, Gabriel like the angel Gabriel. This is significant, but we'll just call him Mr. Utterson. He's important because he's the main character, the protagonist, and we're actually going to follow him throughout pretty much the whole story. Anyway, one day he's on his usual Sunday walk with his distant relative and good friend Mr. Richard Enfield. They are walking through busy London streets when they walk opposite a sinister building which has a door which is clearly neglected and a bit rank really. And Mr. Enfield stops and says, "Did you ever remark that door?" And Utterson says, "Yes," and Mr. Enfield goes on to tell a very odd story connected to the door. A flashback, going back in time while Enfield tells a story, very nice. So Enfield tells Utterson he was walking home at 3 a.m. on a black winter morning, and suddenly he saw the figure of a little man who was stumping along and a young girl running, and the two people collided when they met at the corners of their road. But the man then calmly tramples on the little girl and leaves her screaming on the ground. And Enfield is all like, "Excuse me," and grabs the man and brings him back to the girl and her family and a whole bunch of other people who have now gathered around the scene at 3 a.m, because that makes perfect sense. The worst thing is that the sight of this man makes everyone, including a sensible doctor, go pale and feel immediate hatred. The strange man then offers to pay compensations just so he can get away, because as we know, where there is a blame, there is a claim. And he ends up going inside the sinister building to get £10 in coins and a cheque for £90. However, this cheque is signed by well-known London scientist and their friend, Dr. Jekyll, and Enfield is like, "Scandal! It must be forged!" So he insists on going with the man to the bank in the morning, but sure enough, it's genuine. It is not a forgery. Enfield presumes that the man must be blackmailing Jekyll, as he is such a good man, and this man is, well, not. So Enfield then tells Utterson the name of the man, which is Hyde, and he is not easy to describe. He is deformed in some way, but he can't put his finger on how. Utterson and Enfield say goodbye, and they go home. Chapter 2. Search for Mr. Hyde. At home, Utterson is bamboozled and decides to look at Dr. Henry Jekyll's will. Remember, Utterson is a lawyer, it's his job to do wills and other legal documents and such. And he is shocked to see that it states that upon Jekyll's death, everything should go to Mr. Edward Hyde. He decides to go see his other friend, Dr. Lanyon, to try and make sense of it all. After all, Utterson and Lanyon are Jekyll's oldest and dearest friends. Or are they? Because shockingly, Lanyon tells him that he and Jekyll have fallen out and are no longer speaking, because Lanyon says Jekyll started to go wrong in the mind and his science was all getting a bit mad. Utterson asks him about Mr. Hyde, but Lanyon has never heard of him. Curious. Utterson goes home and has a nightmare about a dark figure trampling a little girl, and then the nightmare morphs into the same dark figure waking Jekyll up and giving him commands, and just more of this dark figure. Utterson wakes up, and because he is mostly disturbed by the fact that the dark figure in his nightmare has no face, it gives him the completely rational and safe idea to stake out the building where Enfield had seen the girl get run over, in the hope of seeing Mr. Hyde. This is where we get that most perfect line, if he be Mr Hyde, I shall be Mr Seek. And surprise, surprise, Mr Utterson sees Mr Hyde and asks to see his face. And just like that clip from Beauty and the Beast where Belle's all like, come into the light. And then he comes into the light and she's like, oh, she's horrified by his face. Yeah, Utterson basically feels that. It's very much that. And Mr Hyde gives Utterson his address. And this is creepier than it sounds, because the only reason Hyde would need to give Utterson, a lawyer, his address is if he believes Jekyll will die soon, and therefore Utterson will need Hyde's address to transfer all of Jekyll's worldly goods to him when he enacts the will. How awful. Next, Utterson visits Dr. Jekyll's house and is greeted by Mr. Poole, the butler. He finds that Jekyll is out, but discusses with Poole, and through this we learn that the door Hyde uses is actually the back door to Jekyll's laboratory. It's kind of like the back of the house, but if that makes sense. Poole says that Mr. Hyde has a key to the lab and that the servants have been instructed to follow Mr. Hyde's orders. To Utterson, this is categorical proof that Jekyll is being blackmailed, and this makes him quite miserable. Chapter 3. Dr. Jekyll was quite at ease. It's time to get your dancing shoes on, everyone, because Jekyll is throwing a party. Except it is the 1800s, so people probably just stand around in a room talking about boring things like how to queue properly or something. I don't know. Anyway, Utterson stays late after people have gone to talk to Jekyll about what he's learnt about Mr. Hyde. Jekyll then turns all pale and starts acting a bit odd about this and says, the moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde, which is a bit of an odd thing to say, but ultimately makes Utterson promise that he will enforce his will. Utterson promises because he is a top bloke. Chapter 4. The Carew Murder Case. Wow, this chapter title doesn't give much away, does it? No. 1 year later. A maid sees a man from her window beat Sir Danver Carew to death with his cane. She identifies the attacker as Mr. Hyde. And Carew is an important member of Parliament, so this is like next level scandal. The police get involved and somehow Utterson gets involved, and Utterson leads the police to Hyde's address, but he is not there. But they find a burnt chequebook and the murder weapon. Because of this, the police are certain Hyde will go to the bank to get his money, because of course, how can he go on the run without this? So they wait at the bank for Hyde to show up, but he never does. And no one has a photo of him, and everyone's account of what he looks like is slightly different. So they got nothing to go on, and they do nothing. And the police just seem pretty inept, which kind of links to all the stuff about Jack the Ripper at the time. But that's another lesson. Chapter 5. Incident of the Letter. Being smarter than the police, or perhaps a bit shady for not telling the police to come with him, Utterson goes to Jekyll's lab to see if he knows where Hyde is. Jekyll looks very ill and has a changed voice, but cryptically replies that Mr. Hyde will never more be heard of, and shows a letter from Hyde that claims he plans to escape and that Jekyll shouldn't worry about him anymore. Utterson keeps this letter and also probes Jekyll further about his will. Jekyll admits that Hyde forced him to make the will and said what should go in it, and Utterson feels Jekyll narrowly escaped being murdered by Hyde. On his way out, Utterson learns from Poole that no letter was ever delivered to the house that day. With the letter from Hyde at his side, Utterson goes to see Mr. Guess, who is a handwriting expert. How does Utterson know all of these conveniently useful people? We will never know. And anyway, Guest says that the handwriting from Jekyll's will and the letter from Mr. Hyde are a match. Essentially, both documents have been written by Jekyll. Utterson cannot understand why Jekyll would write a letter for a murderer. What a snake. Chapter 6. Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. Jekyll is back to his perfectly normal happy self now that Hyde is gone. Hooray. He throws another dinner party and his ex-friend Lanyon is invited. Good times all round. But a few days after the party, Utterson can't reach Jekyll anymore. When he calls round, the butler Mr. Poole just says that Jekyll is not seeing anyone right now. Strange. Utterson visits Lanyon to see what he knows, but Lanyon is deathly ill. He also doesn't want to talk about Jekyll. All that he does say is, After I am dead, you may perhaps come to learn the right and wrong of this, which is such a waste of time. Like, come on, Lanyon, just tell him now. But once again, logic is thrown out of the window for the sake of a dramatic plot. About 3 weeks later, as expected, Lanyon dies, and Utterson receives a letter which he must only open when Jekyll dies. It is at this stage we realise Utterson needs better friends, because this must be far too traumatic for him, and why would you do that to your friend? Chapter 7. Incident at the Window. Windows, doors, Stevenson sure does love his house exteriors. It's just like the start of the story again, because Utterson and Enfield are on one of their little walks and they pass by Jekyll's house. Then they see Jekyll put his head out the window. Wow! Trouble is, he looks extremely sick, so they invite him on a walk. This is the Victorian times, so a walk can cure everything, apparently. But Jekyll declines and is happy to just talk to them from his window. But then he gets this horrified look on his face for no obvious reason and quickly closes the window. Shocked, confused, and probably feeling a bit awkward, Utterson and Enfield leave in silence. Chapter 8. The Last Night. It's very foreboding. Time goes by, and Mr. Paul shows up and says, "Oh, you need to come to Jekyll's house right now because he suspects foul play." What I don't understand is why Paul gets Utterson involved instead of, I don't know, a policeman? It perplexes me, but this wouldn't aid the plot, so logic goes out the window again, I guess. They get to the house, and Paul calls out to Jekyll, who is inside his lab, but the voice that replies sounds nothing like him. Paul says he heard Jekyll cry out 8 days ago, and that voice has been in the room ever since. Paul also says that the voice in the lab asks him to go out and keep looking for this one specific ingredient, but he can never get one that is pure, so he's just going around in circles with this. Utterson wonders if Jekyll just has some strange disease that changes him, but worryingly, Paul says the man looks similar to Mr. Hyde. They believe Hyde murdered Jekyll and for some strange reason has stayed in the lab with the dead body ever since. When Utterson is certain he hears Hyde's voice, both men decide to break down the lab door with an axe and a poker and find a dead Mr. Hyde on the floor, who is wearing Dr. Jekyll's clothes. They look for Jekyll's body, but cannot find it anywhere. Confusion. They also find a huge mirror, which has no place or purpose in a lab. Utterson then finds 3 documents. Number 1, a new will which leaves Jekyll's assets to Utterson. Number 2, a note which has been written that day which tells Utterson to go home and read the letter he received from Lanyon. And document 3, a sealed envelope. Chapter 9. Dr. Lanyon's Narrative. It is now we say goodbye to our faithful friend Utterson. It's been nice. It's been nice knowing him. We now get a whole chapter entirely in the voice of Dr. Lanyon. So we go from the third-person narrative all the way through, and now we get a first-person account. This is his letter to Utterson, which Utterson received earlier. In the letter, Lanyon tells us that he received a letter, which he writes out in full, by the way, from Jekyll asking him to break into the lab and retrieve the ingredients and that a man would come to collect the items at midnight, because that's not creepy at all. Clearly, because he's a much better friend than Jekyll, Lanyon agrees, and the man, who unbeknownst to Lanyon is Mr. Hyde, arrives at midnight. He makes a concoction with the ingredients in the lab, and just before drinking it, asks Lanyon if he really wants to see this. Lanyon has the feeling of, well, I've done all this, and I'm so involved, and naturally curious about what the hell is going on, so yeah, may as well. Hyde drinks the glass, and transforms into Dr. Jekyll. What OMG plot twist of the century? Who saw that coming? Well, yeah, of course we did, but that's only because the story is famous to us. Imagine at the time, this was huge, everyone was bamboozled. It's now clear that this shock is what killed Lanyon. Very sad. Chapter 10. Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. Now we have a new narrator. Hooray! And it's Dr. Henry Jekyll. No, he's not alive, kids. This comes from the third document, the sealed envelope which Utterson picked up from the lab. This is Jekyll's detailed confession. He goes on to say about how he became obsessed with separating the 2 parts of a human, the good part and the evil part. After research, he finds a potion that can do this and transforms him into the worst part of himself, Mr. Hyde. Jekyll, however, finds this exhilarating. He has a great time. He feels so free. He even set up a bank account and a house for Mr. Hyde. Wow! However, One night, without meaning to, Jekyll turns into Mr Hyde in his sleep. This shocked and scared him, as it presented the possibility that he might permanently transform into Mr Hyde with absolutely no control. He planned to stop taking the potion. However, what you want to do is not necessarily what you're gonna do. And he slips up one time, takes it, and ends up murdering Sir Danvers Carew as Mr Hyde. Unsurprisingly, now it's enough to make Jekyll stop taking the potion, so he stops and has all those good times and the good health and the good parties and everything's nice. However, one day he was in Regent's Park enjoying the birds and the flowers and stuff, and he has a vainglorious thought that his goodness is better than other men who do nothing to help others. And because of this small thought of hubris, it causes him to turn into Mr Hyde in broad daylight. It is at this point he wrote to Lanyon to break into his lab and bring him the ingredients, because he needed Lanyon to do this because he's a wanted murderer, and Hyde must hide until nightfall. Once he was back in his lab, it was clear Hyde had taken over, and now he needed a potion just to turn him back into Jekyll, which is why he sent Mr Poole all over town to find the special ingredient for that very potion. Said ingredient could not be found in its pure form, and so he can never maintain this, and in Jekyll's last moments, he wrote this very letter. And that's the end.